People assume the moment a family breaks is loud, dramatic, filled with screaming or slammed doors. But in my case, it began with laughter, polite, effortless laughter that wasn't meant for me. The kind that floats through a backyard on a warm California afternoon while someone quietly disappears inside it. And that's how it felt standing there with a tray of cookies cooling in my hands. Watching my daughter hold court like I was a background prop she forgot to move out of frame. Because that's what happens slowly, invisibly, when respect erodes. You don't notice it cracking, you just wake up one day and realize it's gone. And that afternoon felt ordinary enough to fool anyone looking in from the outside. Sunlight soft on trimmed lawns, glasses clinking, voices rising and falling in practiced rhythms. My daughter's voice the loudest of all, confident, sharp. Dressed in that effortless authority she learned somewhere along the way. And I remember thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was that she spoke so easily to strangers but struggled to look at me. Because I had already learned to stay just out of reach of conversations, hovering near kitchens and counters, places where usefulness still counted for something. So I did what I always did, baked, served, cleaned. And tried not to take up space, because taking up space had started to feel like a mistake. And when I stepped outside offering cookies the way I used to when she was little, the way my mother had taught me, soft voice, careful hands. There was a pause, not long, just long enough to register, and then someone laughed, and then she laughed, and then my daughter said it casually, almost affectionately, like a joke she expected everyone to understand, that I just stayed here. Like a fixture, like something installed years ago and never removed. And no one corrected her, not even the people who took a cookie out of politeness, not even the man she married who smiled and looked away. And in that moment, I understood something painful but important. Humiliation doesn't need cruelty, it only needs witnesses who stay silent, because silence turns disrespect into permission, and I carried that tray back inside with my hands shaking just enough to notice. Because there's a particular kind of shame that doesn't burn hot, it settles cold and quiet. And I spent the rest of that evening doing what invisible people do best, cleaning up after everyone else, listening to laughter drift past me while I rinsed glasses no one thanked me for washing, wiping counters that already shined, and wondering when Mom had quietly turned into my first name, and by the time the house went still and footsteps disappeared upstairs, I wasn't angry yet, just tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Because when someone you raised begins to treat you like an obligation instead of a person, it rearranges something inside you. And I told myself it was nothing, that families go through phases. That grown children don't always see what they're doing, that patience was still the answer because patience had always been the answer. But patience can rot if you leave it too long, and a few mornings later. When a glass slipped from my hands and shattered on the kitchen floor, the sound felt louder than it should have, sharp enough to cut through the house, and before I could even apologize properly, my daughter's voice came down on me like a verdict. Not concern, not surprise, just irritation, as if I had confirmed something she already believed. And when she told me to know my place, I felt something in me stiffen, not because the words were new, but because they were finally spoken out loud. And when she pulled out her phone and threatened to call the police over broken glass and a mistake, I froze, not from fear of the police but from the realization that she meant it. That somewhere between childhood and adulthood she had decided I was no longer protected by love, only tolerated by convenience. And as I stepped outside into the garden I had planted with my own hands, breathing air that suddenly felt too bright, too sharp, I understood that what was happening wasn't just a bad moment. It was a shift, the kind that doesn't reverse itself because when someone threatens you with authority, it means they no longer see you as family, they see you as a problem to be managed. And standing there among plants that had grown under my care, I remembered how this house once held laughter that wasn't conditional. How walls once echoed with a child calling me mama without irony, and how slowly, so slowly, that version of us had disappeared without either of us announcing it. And I realized something else too. Something that hadn't fully formed yet, but was pressing against my chest all the same. Whatever my daughter believed about me, whatever she thought she could take or threaten or control, she didn't actually know the whole truth, not about the house, not about me. and not about how dangerous a woman becomes the moment she stops trying to be welcome and starts remembering who she was before she made herself small. Because patience had run its course, silence had done its damage. And although I didn't know it yet, that shattered glass on the kitchen floor was the sound of something else breaking too, my willingness to disappear quietly. And the next thing she said would push me past the point where forgiveness lived and into a place she never imagined I'd go. People talk about patience like it's a virtue that never expires. Like if you endure long enough, you'll eventually be rewarded with understanding. But no one warns you what happens when patience turns into permission. Because that's the quiet line I crossed without realizing it. The day I started adjusting my life to avoid irritating my own daughter, and it didn't happen all at once. It happened in suggestions dressed up as kindness. Small rules framed as consideration, tiny edits to my existence that seemed harmless until they weren't. Because first it was the cooking. Could I avoid garlic? Could I skip frying? Could I make things lighter? And I agreed. Not because I believed I was wrong, but because peace felt easier than friction. Then it was the volume of the television, the hours I could move around, the way my things were rearranged without asking, my clock replaced, my books shifted. My space quietly shrinking, and I told myself this was normal, that shared homes require compromise, that being older meant adapting. But adaptation has a cost when only one person pays it. And soon I noticed my world narrowing into one room, one chair, one set of acceptable behaviors. Like I was living inside invisible tape lines no one bothered to show me. And every time I complied, the tape tightened. Because compliance teaches people how far they can go, and I had taught my daughter very well. I had taught her that I wouldn't argue, wouldn't resist, wouldn't remind her of who I was before I became convenient. And the strangest part was that I wasn't even angry yet, just confused, because it's disorienting to feel like a guest in a life you helped build. To realize your presence is tolerated only when it's useful, and I still believed. Foolishly, that if I stayed gentle enough, helpful enough, invisible enough, things would soften again, because mothers are trained to believe love fixes everything, even when love isn't what's missing. And then one night I came downstairs quietly to warm some milk, not wanting to disturb anyone, moving like a shadow through a house that no longer felt like it belonged to me. And I stopped at the edge of the hallway when I heard my name, spoken casually, carelessly, like a problem being discussed instead of a person. And I wish I could tell you I misheard, that it was innocent, but the words were clear enough to cut. My daughter's voice steady, annoyed, explaining to her husband that I was always there, that my presence was draining, that it was exhausting to never feel alone in her own home. And he said very little, which somehow hurt more, because silence, when it comes from someone who could intervene, is agreement. And I stood there holding that glass, the milk slowly cooling, realizing that everything I had been feeling had already been decided without me. That I wasn't struggling to belong. I had already been categorized as clutter, and that word stayed with me because clutter is something you clear out, not something you care for. And I went back to my room without a sound, not crying, not shaking, just sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the hum of a house that no longer recognized me. And that was the night something subtle but permanent shifted inside me, because humiliation you can forgive. Loneliness you can rationalize, but being reduced to a nuisance by the person you gave your life to rewrites how you see the world. And still, even then, I said nothing, not the next morning, not the one after. Because silence had become my reflex, my armor, my way of surviving. But armor that's worn too long starts to cut the person inside it. And the more I stayed quiet, the bolder she became, jokes at my expense in front of guests. Remarks framed as humor that landed like truth, comments about freeloading and helping out that erased decades of contribution. And I smiled through them all because I had been taught that mothers endure, that dignity means restraint. That confrontation only makes things worse, but restraint without boundaries is an invitation. And my daughter accepted it eagerly because she had learned something important about me, that I would absorb discomfort to keep things smooth. And she mistook that for weakness, and the moment people mistake your patience for weakness, they start testing how far it goes, and I didn't know then how far she planned to take it. I only knew that the house felt colder. that I was shrinking inside myself, that my silence was no longer protecting me. It was erasing me. And when you're erased slowly enough, you almost don't notice until someone finally says the thing that confirms it out loud. Because silence doesn't break all at once, it fractures, and every fracture makes the next one easier. And by the time my daughter finally raised her voice at me, truly raised it, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of months of quiet permission I never meant to give, months of swallowed words and lowered eyes. And when she snapped at me over something small, something ridiculous, I saw it clearly for the first time, not just her anger, but her certainty, the certainty of someone who believes they have the authority to put you in your place. And that certainty is dangerous, because it only exists when someone believes you no longer have options. And standing there, feeling smaller than I ever had, I realized she thought exactly that. She believed I had nowhere else to go, no leverage, no power, no voice. And for the first time since all of this began, a thought flickered through me, faint but undeniable. A question that refused to stay buried. What if she was wrong? And that question scared me more than her anger ever had, because it meant the story I'd been telling myself, the one where endurance was the answer, was coming to an end, and I didn't yet know what would replace it. Only that whatever came next would change everything, because the next words out of her mouth wouldn't just hurt me, they would force me to choose between disappearing completely or finally remembering what was still mine. There are moments in life that don't arrive loudly but still divide time into before and after. And I didn't know that afternoon would become one of them until the words left my daughter's mouth so cleanly, so casually, that for a second I thought I had misunderstood, because surely no one speaks that way to their own mother without hesitation, without guilt, without at least a flicker of doubt. But she didn't hesitate at all. She didn't lower her voice or look away. She didn't soften it with apology or context. She simply said it like a fact she'd been waiting to state for some time. And the strange thing was that the argument itself wasn't even important, not really. It was something small, forgettable, a minor inconvenience blown out of proportion because it finally had permission to be. And I remember standing there thinking how familiar this felt, the tightening in my chest, the instinct to apologize even when I hadn't done anything wrong, because that instinct had been trained into me over months of being careful. But something stopped me this time, maybe exhaustion, maybe clarity, because I didn't rush to smooth it over. I didn't reach for an excuse. And that pause seemed to irritate her more than anything else ever had. Because people who rely on your compliance panic when it doesn't come immediately. And her voice sharpened, not loud yet, but edged with authority, the kind people use when they believe they're entitled to obedience. And that's when she said it. The sentence that settled between us like a verdict rather than an outburst, that if I didn't leave the house, she would call the police. And for a moment, everything went very still, not dramatic stillness. Just that hollow quiet that follows a sudden realization, because threats change the rules of a relationship. And once you threaten someone with force, even institutional force, you've already crossed a line you can't uncross. And I wish I could tell you I reacted with anger, that I yelled, that I defended myself with the history she seemed so eager to forget. But the truth is I felt something colder than anger, something clearer. Because in that moment I understood exactly how she saw me, not as family, not as someone deserving of grace, but as a problem she was prepared to remove. And that understanding stripped away the last illusion I'd been clinging to. Because arguments can be repaired, misunderstandings can be softened. But once someone invokes authority over you, especially the authority of the law, they've already decided you don't belong. And she pulled out her phone as if to prove she wasn't bluffing, fingers moving with calm efficiency. And that calm frightened me more than shouting ever could, because calm means certainty, and certainty means she had rehearsed this, imagined it, prepared for it. And as I watched her thumb hover over the screen, I realized she wasn't acting out of anger in that moment. She was acting out of entitlement, the belief that she had the right to control who stayed and who left. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from months of watching me comply, of seeing silence mistaken for surrender. And I felt foolish then, not weak. But foolish for thinking endurance would protect me, because endurance only works when both sides respect it. And respect was already gone, and without another word I turned away, not because I accepted her authority, but because something inside me had gone very quiet, very focused, the way it does when a decision is forming before you fully understand it. And I stepped outside into the backyard, the place I had nurtured when everything else began slipping away, and the sun felt too bright, too exposed, like it was illuminating a truth I could no longer avoid, because standing there among plants I had grown from nothing. Listening to her voice still sharp through the open door as she spoke to someone on the other end of the line, I realized she was serious. She was willing to involve strangers, uniforms, paperwork, all to prove a point. And the point wasn't about safety or boundaries, it was about power. And power reveals itself most clearly when it believes it won't be challenged. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted because I wasn't afraid of the police. I was afraid of what staying would turn me into, someone who accepted threats as normal, someone who begged for space in a life she helped create. And I thought of all the years before this, the sacrifices that were invisible now, the life I had built before I ever made myself small. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something that wasn't sadness or resignation, but awareness, sharp and steady. Because once you see the truth clearly, you can't unsee it. And the truth was this. She believed I had no leverage, no options, no claim to anything beyond her tolerance. And as that realization settled, another one followed close behind, quieter but far more dangerous because she was wrong. And she didn't know it yet. She didn't know that the house she was threatening me in carried a history she didn't control, that the power she thought she held rested on an assumption I had never corrected. And as I stood there breathing in the scent of soil and sun, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat steady itself, I understood that the sentence she had just spoken hadn't scared me into leaving. It had freed me from pretending. And the moment she threatened to erase me, she unknowingly gave me permission to stop protecting her version of the story. Because the next thing I did wouldn't involve shouting or pleading or explaining, it would involve action. Quiet and irreversible, and the house she thought she ruled was about to become the center of a truth she had never bothered to learn. Most people think ownership is about keys and bedrooms and whose name gets written on mail, but real ownership is quieter than that. It lives in memory and sacrifice and the invisible work no one sees once the paint dries. And standing there that day, listening to my daughter speak with the confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath her feet answered to her, I realized she had no idea what she was actually standing on. Because that house wasn't just a structure we moved into when it was convenient. It was a life Paul and I had poured ourselves into long before she ever learned how to slam a door. And I don't say that to romanticize the past. I say it because history matters when someone tries to erase you from it. And as I stood in the garden pretending to collect myself, I found my mind drifting backward without my permission, to a time when that house was nothing more than a tired old place with peeling paint and uneven floors. Back when California felt smaller and hope felt heavier, when Paul squeezed my hand and said it had good bones. And we laughed because neither of us knew how much of ourselves we'd end up giving it. We didn't buy it with inheritance or help or luck. We bought it with years of restraint, with missed vacations and secondhand furniture, with weekends spent fixing instead of resting. And while other people upgraded cars, we upgraded plumbing. While others dined out, we learned to cook with what we had. Because building something from scratch teaches you patience in a way comfort never does. And that house absorbed every season of our lives. It watched our daughter grow from a child who raced down hallways into a woman who now paced them with ownership she hadn't earned. It saw scraped knees and birthday candles, arguments and reconciliations, laughter that wasn't measured, and sorrow that wasn't hidden. And when Paul got sick, it held us through that too, its walls witnessing nights when sleep didn't come and mornings when hope arrived late. And after he was gone, the house became quieter but heavier, filled with echoes I didn't know how to live with alone, which is why I agreed to move in with my daughter years later, not because I had to, but because loneliness has a way of making even strong people doubt their footing. And she never understood that distinction. She assumed my move meant surrender, that leaving the house physically meant leaving it behind entirely. But what she never asked, never checked, never even considered was that I hadn't signed anything away. That ownership doesn't dissolve just because someone stops sleeping under a roof. And maybe part of me kept it that way on purpose, not out of distrust at first, but out of instinct. Because mothers feel shifts before they can explain them. And something about the generosity she offered back then had always felt conditional, wrapped in expectation rather than care. And over time, those expectations became rules. And those rules became entitlement. And entitlement grows best when no one challenges it, because she began to speak about the house as if it were already hers, making plans, talking about renovations, discussing equity and refinancing with a casual certainty that stunned me. And every time she did, I felt a small tightening inside my chest, not fear, but warning. And when she finally sat across from me one afternoon holding a folder like a business proposal instead of looking at me like a daughter, I knew exactly where this was heading because she didn't ask how I was. She didn't soften her tone. She simply explained that it would be easier if the house were in her name, easier for taxes, easier for the future, easier for everyone. And the way she said everyone made it clear she didn't mean me. And I remember folding laundry while she spoke, hands moving steadily while my mind raced. Because there it was, the thing she'd been circling for months, the assumption made explicit. And when I told her no, calmly, without drama, without raising my voice, I saw something flicker across her face that I hadn't seen before, not anger exactly, but disbelief. Because people who expect compliance are rarely prepared for refusal. And she tried again, reframing, minimizing, treating it like a harmless formality. But paper has a way of telling the truth even when people don't. And I wasn't about to sign away the last tangible proof that my life before her still mattered. And she left the room irritated, and I thought foolishly that would be the end of it. Because surely even she wouldn't push past a clear boundary. But entitlement doesn't retreat quietly, it looks for shortcuts and days later. When the bank called asking questions I hadn't asked, using language I hadn't authorized, something in me went very still again, because confusion turned to clarity in a single sentence. When I realized she had tried to move forward without me, tried to claim what she hadn't earned by rewriting reality on paper. And that was the moment the story stopped being about disrespect and became about survival. Because when someone is willing to lie to institutions to erase you, they're no longer just unkind, they're dangerous. And as I held those documents in my hands, seeing my daughter's name where mine belonged, seeing her version of events typed neatly like truth, I understood that the house wasn't just a place anymore. It was leverage, it was protection, it was the one thing she wanted that she couldn't control. And the irony was almost painful. Because she believed the house gave her power over me, when in reality, it was the only thing standing between me and complete erasure. And in that moment, something settled inside me with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to explain myself anymore. I wasn't going to beg for decency. And I wasn't going to pretend this was a misunderstanding. Because it wasn't. It was a calculation, and once someone calculates your worth, the only safe move is to change the equation entirely. And the decision I made that afternoon would force her to learn the difference between living in a house and actually owning it. People underestimate how dangerous paperwork can be when it's placed in the wrong hands, because betrayal doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it shows up printed neatly on letterhead with boxes already checked for you. And that's what unsettled me most as I stared at the documents the bank had emailed over. Not the legal language itself, but how confidently my daughter had rewritten reality. How calmly she had reduced my life into a narrative that benefited her. Because there it was in black and white, her name positioned as rightful owner, her role elevated to caretaker, my existence summarized as a technicality. And I remember sitting at the small desk in my room, glasses perched low on my nose, rereading the pages slowly, not because I didn't understand them, but because I needed to accept that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was intention. And intention changes everything, because once someone decides to move forward without your consent, they've already decided you don't matter. And I thought back to that afternoon she'd approached me with the folder, the way she'd smiled too carefully, the way she'd spoken about efficiency and future planning as if love could be notarized. And I realized the refusal I'd given her wasn't just inconvenient. It had disrupted a plan she'd already started. And that's when the anger finally arrived, not explosive or wild, but precise, because anger that comes after clarity doesn't need to shout, it just needs direction. And when I confronted her later that evening, I did it quietly, standing in the doorway of the kitchen while she poured herself a glass of water like nothing had happened. And I told her I'd spoken to the bank, that I knew what she'd tried to do, and for a moment she said nothing at all, didn't deny it. Didn't apologize, didn't even look surprised, which told me everything I needed to know, because innocent people rush to explain, guilty people look annoyed they've been caught. And when she finally spoke, her tone wasn't defensive. It was dismissive, telling me I shouldn't meddle in things I didn't understand, and I almost laughed at that, because I understood exactly what was happening. I understood that she believed time was on her side, that my age worked against me, that eventually I'd get tired or confused or scared enough to hand things over just to keep peace. And when I told her calmly that forging documents crossed a line she couldn't uncross, she looked at me like I was being dramatic. Like legality was just an inconvenience standing between her and what she deserved. And that was the moment something broke cleanly inside me. Because I stopped seeing her as my daughter and started seeing her as a person willing to erase me if it benefited her. And that realization strips away sentimentality fast, because love doesn't survive entitlement unchecked. And when she accused me of being ungrateful, of taking up space, of contributing nothing, I felt the full weight of the irony, because everything she accused me of was exactly what she was doing, projecting her own dependence onto me. And I told her without raising my voice that the house was still legally mine, that no matter how often she said otherwise, facts didn't bend to repetition. And for the first time since this all began, her composure cracked just slightly. Enough for me to see panic flicker beneath the confidence, because panic appears when plans unravel. And she laughed then, a brittle sound telling me ownership didn't really matter, that what mattered was who lived there, who controlled the day-to-day, who people would believe if things got complicated. And that's when she said it again, slower this time, more deliberate, that if I didn't cooperate, I wouldn't be welcome anymore. And the word cooperate hung between us like a threat disguised as reason, because cooperation in her mind meant surrender, and surrender was something I was finally done offering. And I realized then that staying any longer wouldn't protect me, it would endanger me, because people who are willing to manipulate paperwork are willing to manipulate narratives, and narratives are what authorities listen to first. And as she walked away from that conversation convinced she'd reasserted control, I stood there understanding something she hadn't considered, that she'd just shown her hand too early, that by revealing how far she was willing to go, she'd forced me to stop hoping and start preparing. And that night, lying awake in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that no longer felt safe, I didn't cry or pray or bargain with myself the way I might have before. I planned, because planning is what you do when you accept reality instead of wishing it away. And the plan was simple, quieter than she'd expect, and far more final than she imagined, because I wasn't going to argue about the house anymore. I wasn't going to defend my worth or prove my history. I was going to remove myself entirely from her reach, not as a retreat, but as a reset. And that meant leaving on my terms, not hers, with my documents intact and my dignity unnegotiated. And as the hours passed and the house slept, I understood that the signature she wanted from me was the last thing she would ever get. Because the next signature I made wouldn't give her control, it would take it away completely. And before another sun rose over that house, I would walk out quietly and begin the part of the story she never believed I was capable of writing. Leaving in the middle of the night sounds dramatic when people tell it later, but in reality it feels almost ordinary, like slipping out of a life that has already decided it no longer wants you. And I remember how quiet the house was when I finally stood up from the bed, not sneaking, not rushing, just moving with the calm certainty that comes when a decision has already been made inside you. Because once you accept that staying will only cost you more, fear loses its grip. And as I opened the closet and pulled out the small suitcase I hadn't used in years, I realized how little I actually needed. How much of my life had already been reduced without my consent, And that realization felt strangely freeing, because when you've been made invisible long enough, leaving doesn't feel like loss, it feels like relief. And I packed deliberately, choosing documents before clothes, history before comfort. The marriage certificate that proved my life began before my daughter's demands, the deed that proved my past still had legal weight. Photographs that reminded me I hadn't always spoken softly to survive. And as I folded them carefully into the case, I noticed my hands weren't shaking, which surprised me. Because I'd spent months trembling at the smallest confrontation, and yet here I was, steady, clear, awake, and that's when I understood something important about power, that it doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly the moment you stop asking for permission. And when I sat at the small desk and wrote a note, it wasn't long or emotional, because explanations are wasted on people who have already rewritten the story. And I didn't accuse or threaten or beg. I simply stated that I was done negotiating my place in a life I had helped create, that I had nothing left to prove, and that felt truer than anything I'd said out loud in years. And when I placed the note where she would see it, not as a challenge but as a boundary, I felt the last thread of obligation loosen, because obligation without respect is just another word for control. And I walked out through the back door instead of the front, not to avoid being seen, but because the back door still felt like mine, opening into a garden I had tended with patience long before patience was used against me. And the air outside was cool and sharp, the kind that clears your lungs and your mind at the same time. And as I rolled the suitcase down the street, I didn't look back, not because I was angry, but because looking back invites doubt. And doubt was something I couldn't afford anymore, and the motel I checked into wasn't special or comforting, but it was neutral, a place that didn't expect anything from me, and neutrality felt like safety after months of judgment. And as I sat on the edge of the bed listening to unfamiliar sounds through thin walls, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me, because for the first time in a long while, no one was monitoring my movements. No one was deciding when I was welcome, and that calm carried me through the night into morning, when I made the call I'd been avoiding for weeks, not because I didn't know who to call, but because calling meant admitting the situation had become irreversible. And when the voice on the other end answered, steady and unsurprised, I knew I'd waited just long enough, because there are moments when asking for help isn't weakness. It's strategy, and by the time I hung up the phone, the shape of what came next was already forming. Because leaving wasn't the end of the story, it was the setup, the necessary distance required to act clearly. And as I sat there with the documents spread out in front of me, sunlight filtering through cheap curtains, I understood something my daughter never had, that control only works when proximity allows it, and distance changes everything. And the distance I had created overnight would give me something far more valuable than comfort. It would give me leverage, and leverage, once claimed, doesn't need to shout to be felt, because by the end of that day, the house she thought anchored her authority would no longer be under her control, and she wouldn't even see it coming. People assume revenge looks like shouting or confrontation, but the most effective kind doesn't announce itself at all. It moves quietly through paperwork and phone calls while the person who underestimated you is still asleep. And that morning began with a call that felt almost unreal in its simplicity, because instead of arguing or defending myself, I was finally explaining facts to someone who actually listened. And the moment I said the address out loud, the tone on the other end shifted from polite curiosity to professional interest, because ownership carries weight when it's documented, and for the first time in months, I wasn't being questioned as a problem, I was being treated as the authority, and that alone felt like reclaiming oxygen after being underwater too long. And as the conversation unfolded, timelines replaced emotions. Steps replaced apologies, and suddenly the future stopped feeling abstract. Because there's something grounding about logistics when your personal life has been turned into a negotiation you never agreed to. And when the realtor asked if I was sure, if I wanted to think about it, if I needed time, I said no without hesitation, not because I was impulsive, but because I'd already spent months thinking while being erased. And clarity has a way of compressing time, and by the time the call ended, the house was no longer a place I was afraid to lose. It was an asset I was prepared to move, and that distinction mattered because fear makes you freeze. But strategy makes you act, and I remember sitting there afterward, staring at my phone, realizing how quickly things can change once you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. And the rest of the day moved fast, faster than I expected, because the market was ready even if my daughter wasn't. And photos were arranged, listings drafted, details confirmed, all without drama, all without anyone raising their voice. And there was a strange satisfaction in that, knowing that while she believed she still held the upper hand, decisions were being made around her that she couldn't intercept. And when the listing went live, it felt anticlimactic at first. Just another notification, just another screen lighting up, until the phone started buzzing again, and again, because interest has a sound when it arrives. A steady, insistent vibration that tells you've been undervaluing something. And by midday, there were inquiries from people who had never met me but already respected my position. Because paperwork speaks more clearly than family ever had. And as offers began to form, not hypotheticals but real numbers, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was knotted, because possibility has weight, and it shifts how you stand in the world, and for the first time since leaving the house. I allowed myself to imagine a life not shaped by walking on eggshells, not narrowed by someone else's convenience, and the irony wasn't lost on me. That the house my daughter used as leverage against me was now the very thing removing her leverage entirely, and I wondered briefly when she would find out, whether it would be through a call, a notice, or a sudden realization that something foundational had moved beneath her without warning, because people who assume control rarely check for consequences. And as the afternoon wore on and interest turned into commitment, I understood that the story was accelerating whether anyone was ready or not, and I wasn't doing anything secretive or underhanded. I was simply exercising rights I had always had but stopped using out of love. And love that demands self-erasure is not love at all. It's management, and management doesn't survive transparency. And by the time the sun began to dip and the sky shifted colors outside the motel window, there were 3 offers on the table. Each one confirming what I had suspected all along, that I wasn't powerless, I was just patient. And patience, when finally withdrawn, leaves a vacuum that entitlement doesn't know how to fill. And as I reviewed the offers with a calm I hadn't felt in years, I knew my daughter would soon feel the ground shift in a way she hadn't prepared for. Because this wasn't an argument she could win or a narrative she could spin. It was math, law, and timing, and none of those respond to emotional manipulation. And the moment she tried to stop what was already in motion would reveal just how fragile her control had always been. The moment control slips doesn't always come with a crash. Sometimes it arrives sealed in an envelope and delivered by someone who doesn't know the history they're carrying. And by the time my phone confirmed the final details, the decision had already outpaced any attempt to undo it, because paperwork once filed has a momentum of its own. And I remember how quiet everything felt as I reviewed the final offer, not rushed, not emotional, just steady. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about closure, and the buyer I chose wasn't the highest bidder by much. But there was something about her voice, calm and certain, that told me she understood what it meant to start over without apology. And when I signed the documents, my hand didn't tremble because fear had already been spent, and what remained was resolve. And the transaction moved with a precision that felt almost surreal. Signatures confirmed, funds scheduled, ownership transferred, all happening while my daughter was still convinced the house was hers by default. And I wondered briefly how she would react when confronted with a reality she couldn't negotiate her way out of. Because entitlement struggles when it meets finality, and finality had just been notarized. And when the courier delivered the notice later that morning, I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine it clearly enough. The confusion, the rereading, the search for loopholes that didn't exist. Because facts don't soften themselves to protect feelings, and the notice was clear: ownership had changed, tenancy would end, timelines were set, and no amount of outrage would reverse it. And as the messages began lighting up my phone, calls I didn't answer, texts that shifted from angry to frantic in real time, I understood something important about distance, that it allows you to witness chaos without being pulled into it, and that perspective is powerful. Because I could finally see the pattern without being trapped inside it. The assumption that I would fold, that I would explain, that I would rescue her from consequences she'd never expected to face. And when I didn't respond, the silence did what my words never could. It forced her to confront the reality she'd been building toward all along. And by afternoon, the neighborhood had noticed, because nothing spreads faster than disruption in a place built on appearances. And suddenly the story had flipped, whispers replacing certainty, judgment replacing confidence, and for the first time, my daughter was the one being observed, questioned, evaluated. And I felt no satisfaction in that. Only a quiet confirmation that systems work differently than family dynamics. Because systems don't care who you think you are, they only care what's documented, and documentation doesn't lie. And as I sat there in a space that was finally neutral again, watching the day progress without my intervention, I realized that the hardest part wasn't letting go of the house. It was letting go of the role I'd been trapped in. The one that required endless patience and silent forgiveness. And that role had ended the moment ownership did. Because once the house changed hands, so did the power, and power doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. It just needs to exist, and I knew then that the story wasn't finished. Because consequences don't arrive all at once, they ripple, and the next ripple would bring her to my door, not as an authority, not as someone issuing threats, but as someone facing the reality she'd never believed possible. And when that knock finally came, I would have to decide whether distance had made me cruel or simply made me clear. There is a sound people make when they realize certainty has abandoned them, and I heard it long before I saw her, a kind of hesitation that doesn't belong to someone used to being in control. And when the intercom buzzed that evening, it wasn't sharp or demanding, it was tentative, almost careful, and that alone told me how completely the balance had shifted. Because the same woman who once threatened me with police now stood outside asking for permission. And I watched her through the screen for a moment longer than necessary, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. Because seeing someone you love stripped of the authority they once wielded over you is disorienting. And she looked smaller there. Not physically, but in posture, in the way her shoulders curved inward as if she was bracing for something she couldn't deflect with words. And when she spoke, her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child afraid of storms. Apologizing without naming what she was sorry for, asking to come in without acknowledging why she was locked out. And I realized then that this wasn't an apology, it was a request to restore the old arrangement. To put things back where she felt safe again, and that distinction mattered because apologies heal, but requests for comfort after harm just reset the cycle. And as she stood there explaining how she had nowhere to go, how everything had happened so fast, how she just needed time, I felt the familiar pull to fix things rise up inside me, that instinct mothers have to absorb chaos and call it love. And for a moment I was tempted. Because love doesn't disappear just because trust does, and I wondered what it would mean to open the door, to offer shelter one more time. To pretend that the threat of police and forged paperwork and months of erasure were misunderstandings instead of choices. But then I remembered how calm she'd been when she told me to leave. How confident she'd sounded when she believed I had no options, and that memory grounded me, because compassion without accountability is just permission in disguise. And when I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice or accuse her of anything. I said only what was necessary, that she couldn't stay here, not now, not like this. And the silence that followed was heavy. Because boundaries always sound like rejection to people who have never had them placed before. And she tried again. Changing tactics, softening, invoking family, invoking fear, invoking the version of herself she knew still lived somewhere in my heart. And that was the hardest part because she wasn't wrong, that version did exist. But love for who someone was doesn't override the damage caused by who they chose to become. And as she waited for me to relent, I understood that this was the real test, not selling the house, not leaving in the night, but standing still when the consequences arrived at my door, and I stayed still, because staying still was the only way to prove to myself that I meant what I'd done. And when she finally lowered her head, nodded once, and stepped back from the gate, I felt something close to grief pass through me, not for the situation, but for the relationship I'd hoped we could have, the one built on mutual respect instead of control. And as she turned away, alone with her bags and her phone, I didn't watch her walk down the street because I didn't need that image burned into my memory. I already had enough. And I closed the curtain with a calm that surprised me, because calm doesn't mean you don't feel anything. It means you've stopped letting your feelings decide for you. And as the room settled into quiet again, I understood that this wasn't the end of the story, because silence has consequences too. And the final lesson of all this wasn't about property or power, it was about identity. And the last thing I would say about this would be said without anger, without shouting, and without regret. People misunderstand silence. They think it's weakness, avoidance, surrender, but silence is only empty when nothing stands behind it. And what stood behind mine was memory, clarity, and a decision that didn't need defending. Because in the days that followed, as my phone rang less and the world adjusted to a version of events that no longer centered my daughter's certainty, I realized how much energy I had spent trying to remain acceptable instead of remaining myself. And that realization settled into something steadier than anger, something closer to peace, because peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the absence of self-betrayal, and I no longer felt the need to explain why I had done what I did, because explanations are only required when you still need approval, and I didn't, not anymore. And in the quiet of my new apartment, high above the city noise but close enough to feel its pulse, I rebuilt my days slowly, deliberately, choosing what to keep and what to leave behind. Planting herbs on the balcony not because anyone expected it, but because I wanted to, drinking tea without rushing, sleeping without listening for footsteps, existing without editing myself for someone else's comfort. And sometimes I thought of my daughter not with bitterness but with clarity, because love doesn't disappear when boundaries appear. It just changes shape. And the love I held for her now included distance, accountability, and truth. Things she hadn't been ready to accept, and maybe someday she would be, maybe she wouldn't. But that outcome was no longer mine to manage, because motherhood doesn't mean martyrdom and sacrifice doesn't mean erasure. And the lesson I carried forward wasn't that standing up for yourself destroys families. It's that allowing yourself to be diminished teaches others how to do it again, and again, and again, until there's nothing left and I had come too far. Lived too much, given too much to let that be my ending. And when I looked out at the city lights each evening, watching them blink on like quiet affirmations, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not triumph, not revenge. Just dignity returned to its rightful place, because dignity doesn't need an audience, it only needs permission to exist. And I finally gave myself that permission. And if there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Loyalty that costs you your identity is not loyalty, it's fear dressed up as love. And silence, when chosen instead of forced, becomes power, not because it punishes others, but because it protects you. And I didn't sell a house to hurt my daughter, I sold it to save myself. And sometimes saving yourself is the bravest, quietest thing you'll ever do. And if you're listening to this because you recognize yourself somewhere in these words, because you've been patient past the point of reason, kind past the point of safety, quiet past the point of dignity, then let this be the moment you stop apologizing for existing, because you don't need to shout to reclaim your life. You just need to remember what's yours and have the courage to stand in that truth, calmly, firmly, without asking anyone's permission ever again.